You're listening to audio from Journey Bible Church. Join us every week for sermons from God's Word by subscribing to this podcast wherever you like to listen most. If you would like to connect with us, head to journeybible.org/connect.
So if you don't know me, I am a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and I struggle with anger and rejection and addiction, and my name is Keith. Hey, Keith. Thank you. Friends of mine over here on the front. And the reason why I would introduce myself like that is because in Celebrate Recovery, that's how we introduce ourselves. We're connecting my identity with Jesus Christ. I'm a believer in Jesus Christ, and then what I struggle with, addiction, anger, rejection, those are other things that are my struggling or crippling sins. That's not my identity. And it's important because you will see different when you get into secular recovery programs. They will identify themselves and connect themselves to their addiction as being a part of their identity or whatever that is that they struggle with. So important to know that. If you're not familiar with Celebrate Recovery, it's a 12-step program. It's a Christian program. It literally started back in about 1935 with a very conservative group called the Oxford Group, which was a Christian group, a Christian church. And they were connected with some other folks who put together the 12 steps that are really right out of the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. And they paired that also with the book of James and came up with the 12 steps. I tell people all the time, it is a rigorous discipleship program. So if you're kind of stale in your faith journey and you're like looking for next step, next level, I would recommend Celebrate Recovery. We're going to be kicking off. We're going to do what we would call a soft launch on the 31st of March. And if you say soft launch just literally means give us a little grace because we're starting. We're actually starting for real on April 14th. But we're opening it up to our church, our home here. This is your church. Come and be a part of it on that date. And if you're saying, like, I'm not sure if I belong in Celebrate Recovery, like I'm not an addict, I would tell you that only 30% of the people who come to Celebrate Recovery struggle with addiction. The rest struggle with other what we would call hurts, habits, and hangups. So if you're thinking about it, if you have anything that you struggle with, then you qualify. If you say, I really don't have anything, we call that denial. You definitely have something that you struggle with. Starting right here. So this, we are starting today. I'm preaching the third in a series that we came from Rick Warren's book, Life's Healing Choices. That book is for sale out in the lobby. And he did this sermon series about 25, it's been over 25, almost 30 years ago, on life's healing choices. And today's message is called Repairing Relationships or Forgiveness. And you could kind of do the inverse of that, wrecking relationships or unforgiveness. Because the reality is, if you're not doing one, you're doing the other. And I would tell you that as a counselor of over 30 years, I have learned that social pain is inevitable. Nobody gets a pass on that. We all experience just that social pain. My biggest wound is rejection. And so that's how I would identify my struggle is rejection, which equals social pain, which often leads to depression and other things, which just like anybody else who struggles with social pain, by the way, if you're in relationship, you have social pain. The reason why is because none of us are perfect. So hurt people hurt others. And when you're around other people, they struggle. And so they're going to hurt you just like you have hurt them. Social pain really is the root of all of our compulsive or sinful behavior that literally leads us to what we would call insanity. In other words, doing the same thing over and over and over and hoping to get a different result. Trying harder and giving up and going through that same thing. Of course, the only antidote for that is forgiveness. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And we could probably all agree that forgiveness is a great idea until we have to practice it, right? Like, it's easy for me to talk about forgiveness, but forgiving, actually going through the steps and being intentional about forgiveness is not so easy. In this step in Celebrate Recovery, I'm supposed to make a list of all those who have wronged me and then forgive them. First, I'm willing to, and then I have to forgive them. So here's what I want you to do, right? I want all of you to be thinking, right? Get your wheels spinning a little bit and say, who in my life has hurt me, or what event in my life has hurt me in such a way that I need to add them to the list? Now, don't write anything down because they may be sitting next to you, okay? It's a reality. But think about it. Just think about it, because we all know somebody in our relationship spheres that has hurt us, that has wounded us in some way. One or two people. Just think about that. And when it comes to true biblical forgiveness, most of us would have lists that look more like a book. That's just the reality. Most of us walk around with a lot of unforgiveness in our life. Now, again, making the list was easy for me. It was actually doing the forgiving part that was hard. And I think we'll all agree that that's probably where we live. The first time I made a list and was intentional about this, like took it from my brain and wrote it down, was in 2005, September 2005, almost 18 years ago. And my list included my biological mother, who gave me up for adoption and gave me up to complete strangers, right? That's what adoption is. Both my grandfathers dying by the time I was 8 years old, and one of them taking their lives. My best friend dying from a brain tumor when I was in the 6th grade. At the same time, in the 6th grade, I moved to the other side of town and had to start all over in a new school and experience sexual abuse. And then thought I had a confidant, somebody that was close to me, and I thought, I'm gonna share that with them because I need to do something with this. And we were in a library, so I thought that was a good place to do it. Well, we got in the library line, and before we left the library, he had shared it with everybody in the library line. More need of unforgiveness. Then, as I went in the military, I had a girlfriend at that time who was unfaithful to me. So she got added to the list. By the way, this list is not complete. This is just a few of the highlights, right? And then as a pastor, believe it or not, you guys are always so nice. And so I have some church hurt. Mike, you don't have any church hurt. Good. You guys have been great to him. I haven't been here long enough to have any church hurt here, so you guys are good, right? You guys all get a pass. But just know that happens too, right? If you've been in a church, sometimes you've been in a church and you've experienced church hurt, not even as a pastor. So each of those people or those events, if you will, stole something from me, right? They owe me a debt. They took something from me. And so hurt and broken, my reaction to that is to punish them through anger, through isolation. I'll cut them out. If you're on Facebook, you unfriend them, right? There's a lot of ways that we punish people. And the reality is we're really not punishing them. A lot of times they don't even know that we've unfriended them. I'm one of those guys who has a Facebook account that only uses it to put my pictures on. So if you unfriend me, you're not doing any damage to me. I don't even know if you're not on my Facebook group anymore. So forgiveness, here's what I would say. Forgiveness is not something we can take lightly. It's the prescription and the antidote for brokenness. In fact, forgiveness releases our body's natural opioids, which are endorphins. It's the same thing that's released when you get a runner's high, right? When you exercise and you get done, you're like, man, I feel great. It's that natural opioid that's released, and it happens when there's forgiveness. Today's topic can stress relationships or even destroy our lives. It's the inability to accept and offer forgiveness. In Celebrate Recovery, we use these 8 principles, which is what our sermon series is coming from these next few weeks. And this one is on principle 6, which is literally this: evaluate all of my relationships, right? I'm giving you just a couple. Get the wheels spinning. Who are those in your relationship spheres that need to be forgiven? Offer forgiveness to those who have hurt me and make amends for harm I've done to others, except when to do so would harm them or others. The verse we connect to that is Matthew 5:7, which just says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. By the way, you may be taking notes. I see a lot of people taking notes. I love that. The notes are in the Bible app. If you have the Bible app, you can open that up. I don't know if it's the same on all phones, but on my iPhone, on the bottom right is a spot that says more. You click on more, and when you do that, then scroll down, you'll see events. When you click on events, our church should populate right at the top, Journey Bible Church. You click on that, all the notes are in there. Winning, right? Made it easy for you. So you don't have to make feverish notes anymore. It's all in there. So for the next few minutes, I want to talk about how to give and receive forgiveness. It's the only way that we can get completely free from our resentments, the anger, the fear, and even shame and guilt that plague us in our lives. And I want to start by asking 3 questions. And these are in your notes, but these 3 questions got to be answered. And I believe they're sequential. In other words, you can't go on to the next one until you've done the first one. Does that make sense? So as we go through these, I'm going to start with the first one is, have you received God's forgiveness? Have you received God's forgiveness? And if you want to open your Bibles or your Bible app to Matthew chapter 18, I'm going to spend most of the time this morning in Matthew chapter 18. I'm going to jump around and use some other scriptures, but primarily Matthew chapter 18, because I believe this is the greatest story. And it's just to set it up a little bit. Jesus and Peter were having a conversation. And Peter came to Jesus, as always, with a little bit of a confusion, maybe a chaos in his brain, and he was trying to figure out, how many times should I forgive somebody, right? Because the reality is, we all get relationship pain. We all get that social pain that happens, and am I supposed to forgive him like 7 times? Like, in his mind, that's the limit, right? Gonna forgive 7 times, which is important because the number 7 in the Bible is the number of perfection. And so in his mind, that's it. 7 times, I'm done, right? I can count it. It has a finite end to it. And so he says to him, Lord, how often should I forgive my brother when he sinned against me? As many as 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you 7 times, but 77 times. Some versions will say 70 times 7. Now, if you're looking for a Greek definition of what that is, how big is that number? How many have watched the Toy Story? I'm starting to date myself because when I use movies like the Toy Story, nobody raised their hand. Really, like, raise your hand high if you've seen the Toy Story. Okay, that's better. You guys were just sitting there. All right. Wake up. I'll make you stand if you want. We can stand the whole time I'm preaching. So the Toy Story, there's this guy in there, Buzz Lightyear, and he says, to infinity and beyond. That's how many times you forgive somebody, over and over and over and over with no end. That's what that number means, without end. And then he goes on to verse 23. He said, therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle his accounts with his servants. And we began to settle. One was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. So get the picture as he's thinking through this, and I'm going to kind of summarize even the next 2 verses there, verse 25 and 26. He owed this huge amount of money, this huge debt, 10,000 talents. 10,000 talents would be likened to an annual salary of every person in the city of Palestine at that time, which was about 500,000 to 600,000 people in population. Okay, so you get the idea how big that debt is. 500,000 to 600,000 times an annual year's salary. That's how much he owed. And this guy comes to this king, the guy that he owed the money to, and he said, humbly, will you forgive me? Like, there's no way I can pay this. Like, I'll work for you. I'll get my family to work for you. We'll work for you the rest of our life. Just forgive, just cancel that debt. The next verse there, verse 27 says this, out of pity. In other words, I recognize the fact that you have no means to pay this. And I'm going to give you something you don't deserve. Like, there's no way you can make this right. The master of that servant released him and forgave him of the debt. Anybody think of a debt that was owed that was so big that you couldn't pay? The truth is, all of us have a sin debt, right? Sin is stepping outside of God's will, stepping outside of what God ordained, right? When we're disobedient, when God says do this or don't do this, he's given us these things so that we could be in relationship with him. When we step outside of that, we sin. And so we're in that place. And if we sinned one time, we would need a Savior. And the reality is we've got a lifetime of sin. And that's just the stuff that we know, right? That others might know that they've seen us. What about all the things that we've thought? That's 10,000 talents. It's more than you and I could ever repay. And that's what Jesus did for us. No matter how severe the sin is, no matter how big it is, no matter what kind of injury we've done to somebody, God's forgiven it. I love what Romans 3:22 and 23 says, and this is a different version than you're probably used to, but I love the language he used in here. He says, God puts right, or people right, through their faith in Jesus Christ. It's the idea that sin causes chaos. Like I said, it's already like our lives are unmanageable. Mike said that in the beginning 2 weeks ago, that we needed God, that we couldn't be God. We had to realize that. And that's what sin is. It's insanity. And what happens is God steps into our insanity and he makes right. So if you could imagine chaos, right? Like atoms, like remember when you were in science and atoms are bouncing all over. He brings it into alignment. He puts right us. He makes us and puts us in right standing with him when we receive his forgiveness. Even if I've sinned one time. So the first question that we've got to reconcile is, have I received God's forgiveness? And the truth is, if you've received God's forgiveness, now you're ready to go on to the next one, right? Ready to go on to the next one, which is, have I forgiven myself? Now, this is the idea that what I have done is so big that it's unforgivable. And I've run into this as a counselor a lot, and even as a pastor. People will come to me and say, but man, you don't know my life, man. You don't know my history. Like there's a lot. It's a lot. I've done some bad things. God can't forgive me. I mean, I know guys who have murdered. I have friends who have murdered, spent 35 years in prison. I know people who have done abortions, and they would say that my sin is so bad that God can't forgive me. And even if God forgives me, I can't forgive myself. And they're living in that place. You know, for years, I held my bullying last words to my best friend over my head because I couldn't get them back. You see, I told you that he died. What happened, though, was we were out snowmobiling in South Dakota in hayfields, 70 miles an hour, 2 RUP 440 snowmobiles, racing, having a great time, lots of snow, and somewhere in the middle of that, he stopped and he said, man, I can't do it anymore. He said, I've got a really bad headache. And of course, that struck my rejection nerve. Like, when you quit doing something with me, when you quit doing life with me, you don't want to be around me anymore, that's rejection. And that's all I was hearing. And the reality is, he had a real headache. In fact, they took him to the emergency room in the hospital. They life flighted him from there to Denver, Colorado, and discovered that he had a golf ball-sized tumor in his brain that was malignant. Did surgery. He went into a coma, never came out of that coma. And 5 months later, I was at his funeral. And you see, I was carrying a lot of guilt and a lot of shame because our last words together were me bullying him and calling him names about not continuing to do what we were doing, having fun. I struggled with forgiving myself, which is kind of crazy, right? Like, when you think about forgiveness and holding something over our head, the reality is God's canceled the debt. What I'm saying is, yeah, God, let me hold on to this. What you did wasn't good enough. I'm almost saying that what he did at the cross wasn't good enough. I'm holding that over my head. I think of the story in Luke chapter 15 of a man who was a prodigal, who went into a far country, spent his father's inheritance. And when he came to himself, he came to the end of his wild living, his sinful lifestyle, he went back to his father and he began to rehearse this little speech. He said, Father, he said, I've sinned against you and I've sinned against earth, and I am no longer worthy to be called son. Let me just work for you the rest of my life. That's what happens when we don't forgive ourselves is we have this false belief, this false reality that what I have done is so bad that I'm never going to be able to be a son again. I can't be called his son. I'll just work my way into favor. So we go to church, we read our Bible more, we pray more, we do all these good deeds so that we can work off our debt. The reality is the debt's canceled. We got to be able to forgive ourselves. It's more than he could pay. Matthew 18, verse 25 says, and since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold, and his wife and his children and all that he had, in order to pay for payment to be made. We've got to forgive ourselves. And not only do we have to receive God's forgiveness and forgive ourselves, but the third thing is, have you forgiven those who have hurt you? Have you forgiven those that have hurt you? And there's two reasons why we need to do that. One is because God's forgiven us. Because God's forgiven us. Matthew 5:7 again says, blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. It doesn't say that they have to earn it. It doesn't say that they deserved it. But they got mercy because of no reason. And we have to give mercy because it's been given to us. Colossians 3 says it this way, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against you or against another, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you. The truth is, I will never have to forgive anybody more than God has already forgiven me. Did you hear that? I'll never have to forgive anybody more than God has already forgiven me. Remember, 10,000 talents, it's 500,000 to 600,000 years salary versus what he owed, much smaller amount. The truth is, as we think about that, I always think about tug of war. When I was in the military, we used to play tug of war in the Army, and that was part of our physical training, PT. Loved it. We loved doing PT. That was fun, right? Instead of just doing push-ups and burpees and all that stuff repeatedly. But when you think about tug of war, the rope keeps you tethered to the other team, right? You both pick it up and you dig in, and the more you pull, the more the other team pulls, and you dig in and you get lower and you drop your center of gravity and you hold on more and you start doing things in unison and you really work hard in that war. Forgiveness is like when you drop that rope in tug of war. It ends the pain cycle. It says, I'm not going to hold that debt over their head anymore. You drop the rope and the war stops. When my best friend died, I was mad at God. I couldn't believe that he let my best friend die. I had prayed over and over and over that God would spare him. I believed I would sit beside his bed when he was in a coma, just knowing that he was going to open his eyes. That was going to be it. He was going to come back. We were going to do life as normal. And I was angry at God because he allowed that to happen. Can I tell you that he didn't cause it and he wasn't to blame? We all know that God can't sin. And he's good and he's perfect. And it's impossible for him to do wrong and need our forgiveness. But that doesn't negate the fact that sometimes we hold debt over God's head. I felt like I had been wrong, like God didn't do what I wanted him to do. And so in some ways, even though God didn't need forgiveness, I was holding debt over his head. So not only do we forgive others in that, but sometimes we have to forgive God. Does that make sense? Like I'm holding a debt over his head. God didn't do anything wrong. And that also helps us to understand that we have to understand free will. While we may not need him to forgive, we got to drop the rope. Once we understand free will, we're going to understand that our anger towards God sometimes has been misplaced. In fact, most of the time, it's been misplaced. Free will is simply this. He loved us so much that he gave us a free will. Each one of us has the right and the ability to choose right and wrong. Therefore, we need to believe that the harm others did to us was from their free will. It was their choice, not God's. And it wasn't God's will. Can I just say, if you've been the victim of physical, sexual, emotional abuse, I hurt with you. I've experienced those things as well. And I want you to know that God was in the middle of that. God did not leave you abandoned, nor did God cause that. And forgiveness is the only way out. Doesn't mean that you have to be besties with your perpetrator and go back and refriend them on Facebook. But it does not give you a pass in forgiving that person and canceling their debt. Remember, forgiving them in no way excuses them for the harm that they've caused, but it will release you from the power that they've had over you. So first, we forgive others, not only because God forgave us, but also because resentment doesn't work. Resentment doesn't work. Look at verse 28 with me. It says, but when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, pay me what you owe. You realize that resentment makes us do some pretty stupid things? I mean, this guy went out in full-on UFC. How many watch UFC? Nobody wants to admit that in church, right? I watch UFC. I just said it out loud. He full-on UFC choked this guy out for 100 denarii. That's about 100 days' salary, not years, not 500,000 years' salary, 100 days. Do you see the disparity? He had gotten forgiven of a debt that he would never repay, not even with the help of his family. And he went out and choked out somebody else, held debt over their head, unforgiveness over their head for a much smaller sin. So think about it. That one or two people that you put on your list, I'm not minimizing, and I'm definitely not excusing what they've done. But what they've done pales in comparison to what you and I have done over a lifetime, or what we have thought over a lifetime. And by the way, we ain't done. We ain't done. We're going to walk out those doors and it's going to continue. The debt just keeps ringing up. And he forgave it. We just have to receive it. It's been said that resentment is like drinking poison and then expecting the other person to get sick. It's foolish. It's unresponsible. It's one of the unhealthiest emotions we can have. And in anger, his master delivered him over to the jailers. And this is another piece that we need to see. And I love, I think it's the King James that says, turned him over to the tormentors, to be tormented day and night. The reality is when we don't forgive, again, it doesn't necessarily even hurt them. We think we're punishing them because we're not forgiving them. It gives us some control when we don't forgive. But the reality is we're the ones that get punished. We're tormented day and night. Losing sleep because you're mad at somebody? Can't eat right because you're mad at somebody? Health problems because you're mad at somebody? You haven't forgiven them? Try forgiveness. Try forgiveness instead of drinking the poison, hoping that they'll get sick. Dr. S.I. McMillan, who's a Christian author and psychologist, doctor, wrote a book that showed that the two greatest causes of physical problems in your life are guilt and resentment. He said, it's not so much what you eat, it's what eats you that matters. Think about that former girlfriend or boyfriend or spouse who has wronged you in some way, or maybe a teacher who's embarrassed you in school, or a parent that never told you that they loved you to this day. Maybe that person that you were dating that just dropped you. Unforgiveness will literally drain your body of life. Now, if you've tuned out, tune back in, because I'm going to give you the how-tos, what to do. When you came in, you may or may not have gotten a bookmark. If you didn't, grab one on the way out. That's where these are going to come from. So this is really just, how do I forgive? How do I forgive those who have hurt me? And just three simple things. One is you reveal the hurt. And it's really important. So again, I told you at the beginning to be thinking about that event, that person, but reveal the hurt. That means write it down. Again, don't do it now because they might be sitting next to you, okay? I don't want to do marriage counseling on the way out. Just think about it. This is what we got to do. First, write it down. Admit it. Let it out. Face it. Be honest about it. Don't deny that there's pain there. It's difficult to forgive a person if you haven't clearly stated it. Truth is, people have injured you. So admit it. Write it down. That hurt. Put it down. And it hurt me. Coworker, relationship, parent, whoever it is. Number two, you have to release the offender. Release the person who did pain to you. You're canceling that debt. You're saying, in effect, I release my offender. I'll let them go. I'm going to stop holding that hurt over their head. So how do I do that? You do it simply by giving them what they don't deserve. You're giving them what they don't deserve. Because what they deserve is to be punished, right? They wronged you. They hurt you. Just like you and I, what we deserve for our sin is what? Death and hell. Every single one of us has a one-way ticket to hell, but for the grace of God in our life, receiving his sin payment frees us from that. Cancel that debt. Release them. Realize that forgiveness is a gift that we choose to give. It's not a feeling. By the way, they don't have to ask you for you to give them forgiveness. Sometimes there's a false belief. Well, when they ask me, or when they treat me this way, or when they stop doing this, then I'll forgive them. No, it's unconditional. The next question is, how often do I have to forgive them? Going back to our passage of scripture, 7 times? No, 77 times. That's a indeclinable noun in the Greek. I knew you'd be impressed with that, Mike. Indeclinable noun. So you guys are football fans if you live here. I know that, right? I've come to understand that Kansas City is Chiefs fans, and it's a thing. And I've got to get on board or I'm going to get left behind. So I'm a Chiefs fan now. But it's like if you're standing on the line of scrimmage and the defense goes across the line of scrimmage before the ball's snapped, right? What do we call that? Encroachment, right? And if they take the snap, they get a free play. They get a free play. As long as they can get that play off before the whistle's blown, they get a free play. And they get the opportunity to decline that penalty. The reality is, when we're asked by God to forgive 77 times, that's an indeclinable noun, meaning you don't get a pass. You don't get a pass. Every one of us, because we were forgiven a debt that we would never repay, has to forgive again and again and again and again. We don't get a pass on it. So here's an effective way to do that in the last couple minutes here. Visualize, if you will, get 2 chairs out sit in one of them and visualize your offender in the other one. They're not actually there, but visualize that they're there. So you've made your list, and you begin and you say, hey, I need to say some things to you. And I begin to list out all the ways that they have hurt me with as much detail as you can remember, to include how did it make you feel, which is difficult for us because we've shut those feelings down because that's how we protect ourselves. So you're telling them how they hurt you, and then you let them know, you know what? I'm going to forgive you because God has forgiven me, and I have learned that resentment doesn't work. I'm going to forgive you. Another way to do that is to write a letter and basically do the same thing. You write them down. Don't send the letter. You put their name. You write all the detail of what they did, and you let them know, I forgive you at the end of that letter. You release them, not so that they experience freedom, but so that you experience the freedom, right? The third thing we do after we've revealed the hurt, we've released them through those couple of ideas that I just suggested, the third thing we do is we accept them unconditionally. And this is the place that I think most of us get hung up. In other words, I'll forgive them, but I'm never gonna, right? Fill in the blank. In other words, you might as well say, I'll forgive them, but I'm gonna continue to punish them. I'm gonna continue to be mad at them. I'm gonna continue to ignore them and cut them out of my life. That's not true forgiveness. So how do you know when you fully release them? When you can think about them and you truly want the best for them. You truly want the best for them. You're able to pray for them. You're able to wish them well. You're able to bless them. You can begin to look at understanding their hurt rather than focusing on how they hurt you, because hurt people hurt others. So how do I forget divorce, or how do I forget the pain that I've experienced from my parents growing up, or the pain of a physical or sexual or emotional abuse or neglect, or even trauma in my life? The reality is you can't. Forgiveness doesn't mean that it's forgotten. It's remembering that it's been forgiven. It doesn't mean that you've forgotten, because the reality is Satan is masterful. He's going to continue to remind you of what somebody did to you so that you can hold that over them, because he knows that's going to steal your Christian joy. It's going to keep you locked up in your sanctification process and becoming more like Jesus as you hold unforgiveness. It's simply remembering that it's forgotten. Well, how do I do that? That's unfair. How can I forgive somebody? If I forgive them, then they get away scot-free. Remember this, God's just. He's good. He's going to take care of it. He's the judge. The fact is, relationships can tear your heart into pieces, but God can glue those pieces back together and cover it with his peace over your pieces. So at the bottom of your bookmark there, it says, to love is to risk. And so I'm going to dare you to be intentional about forgiveness starting today. Don't put it off. Start today. And if the empty chair, if you get to the place where you've made your list and the empty chair doesn't feel sufficient, or maybe even writing a letter, I like the more dramatic. I like to make my list and then get rid of it this way. And I think about how God took care of my sin and your sin, right? He removed it as far as the east is from the west. Put it into the depths of the seas. Thanks for letting me share.
This podcast was produced by Journey Bible Church in Olathe, Kansas. If you're interested in learning more about our church, visit journeybible.org. Thanks for listening.